Good morning. It has been a warm week. Hopefully it's going to stay warm for a while, I guess. Before we get into our lesson this morning, I do have a couple of prayer requests. One, please keep our teenagers in your prayers, or keep me and Lauren in your prayers, as we'll be traveling with some teenagers and a few other adults to Dollywood this Thursday. And so we'll be leaving at the bright early time of 6 a.m. and getting back late. And so it'll be a fun trip, but please just keep us in your prayers, and as we have a fun trip but a safe trip and are able to spend time together. And then also pray for me. I will be going to Tennessee to do a gospel meeting starting this coming Sunday at Midway, and it'll be the first one I've ever done. And so you can ask my wife. I've been getting anxious and worried and just pray that it'll be a good meeting and the word will be spoken and it'll stay true, and hopefully we'll be back with you all the next week. So our lesson comes from the book of Judges, chapter 11. And this story, well, you read it, and the first thing that comes to mind is, I'm like, why hasn't Hollywood pulled this and made a movie out of it yet? Because it's a Hollywood movie for the most part. You got a kid born to a family that doesn't want him. He's rejected. He runs away. He goes bad. Time passes, and wouldn't you know it, the family comes back to needing this young boy to lead them, to keep them safe. And so he comes back to his family. He leads them. He wins the battle over the bad guys. The credits roll, and we get a cut scene telling us what the sequel is going to look like. But that's your typical Hollywood movie, and this isn't your typical Hollywood movie. This is the Word of God. And this story, the story of Jephthah, there's a subplot. And it's a minor one, I guess, in one sense, but it's a terrible one. It's a tragic one. It's dark. It casts a shadow over the victory that Israel has over the Amorites. And there's truth in the mistake that Jephthah makes, and we're going to look at that today. So, open your Bibles, Judges chapter 11. Let's read the first 3 verses. It says, "Now Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty warrior, but he was the son of a prostitute. Gilead was the father of Jephthah, and Gilead's wife also bore him sons. And when his wife's sons grew up, they drove Jephthah out and said to him, 'You shall not have an inheritance in our father's house, for you are the son of another woman.' Then Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob, and worthless fellows collected around Jephthah and went out with him." So, we get some background on who this guy is, Jephthah. His father's name was Gilead. His mother was a prostitute. Gilead's wife actually had several sons of her own, and as they grow up, they force Jephthah to leave his home. They tell him, verse 2, "You will not get any of our father's property because you are the son of another woman." And he runs away, and he becomes like Robin Hood. He has his band of outlaws, and they go and do their thing. So, I asked myself, who was this man? He was a mighty warrior, the very first verse tells us, but, he was an outsider. He was unloved, unwanted by his family. He was treated like trash. When he finally got big enough to fend for himself, his brothers reject him, send him away, possibly because they had no intentions of sharing the inheritance that their father would pass down. Their father would pass down an inheritance. The firstborn would get a double portion, and then the rest would kind of spread it out among themselves. And so, hey, let's get rid of Jephthah. He's a stepbrother, a half-brother, and we'll have more of our dad's inheritance. And so Jephthah leaves. He is unloved. He's angry. And he goes to Tob, and he finds himself surrounded by outcasts, miscreants, and rogues. But then, the irony of the universe comes back into play here, because time passes and his family needs help. The Amorites are rising up to take them on. And they need a warrior. They need a fighter. They need somebody to lead them. And guess who that will be? That would be Jephthah. Verses 4 through 6. After a time, the Ammonites made war against Israel. And when the Ammonites made war against Israel, the elders of Gilead went to Jephthah from the land of Tob. And they said to Jephthah, "Come and be our leader, that we may fight against the Ammonites." The outsider, the one who was rejected, the one who was unloved, unwanted, well, he becomes the leader of the very people who rejected him. He becomes the warrior they need, the negotiator they need. For most of the chapter, he's negotiating with the king of the Ammonites because they're like, "Why are you attacking us?" And he's like, "Well, look back into history. What happened? We wanted to be peaceable. And a former king of yours rose up to fight us. But the Lord God was with us, and he gave us your land." And he defeats the Ammonites. Verses 32 and 33. So Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites to fight against them, and the Lord gave them into his hand. And he struck them from Aroer to the neighborhood of Minnith, 20 cities, and as far as Abel Kerim, with a great blow. So the Ammonites were subdued before the people of Israel. The story is good so far. It's going along. We're happy with where it's going. The tragedy happens next, or the tragedy happens before the battle. Jephthah made a vow. He struck a bargain with God. He made a very dangerous choice. Back up to verse 30. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, "If you will give the Ammonites into my hand," verse 31, "then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering." A foolish thing for this leader to do because it broke him. Jephthah made a foolish pledge, a foolish decision. And really it was foolish because he didn't really think about what he was saying. You think about what the home looked like back then. The people, their livestock, it was all together. He had no idea what would come out of that door. It could have been one of his prized goats, one of his prized sheep, his bull. It could have been anything. Now, he probably had in mind that, an animal would come out and he would make a sacrifice to God, but that's the foolish part of what Jephthah did. He had no control over what would happen. And, you back up a little bit further, it says the Spirit of the Lord was with him as he went on this journey. There was no need for the vow to begin with because God was already with him, but he made one. And it ends up tragic. Verses 34 and 35. Jephthah came to his home at Mizpah. He's won the battle. They're celebrating. Behold, his daughter came out to meet him with tambourines and with dance. She was his only child. He had neither son nor daughter. And as soon as he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, "Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. You have become the cause of great trouble for me, for I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow." I can't imagine what went through his mind because he's on top of the mountain. He's brought victory to his people. They're going home. They're celebrating. It's a parade. And he turns and he rounds the corner to his home, and the first person he sees, the first object he sees, his only daughter. And the worst part, the text says he kept his vow. At the end of the 2 months where she went to the mountains to mourn, she returned to her father, who did with her according to his vow that he had made. And we're not going to get into the discussion of whether he actually sacrificed his daughter or if there was another means. There's 2 or 3 different thoughts to where that goes. But I want to focus more on why he made the vow than what happened after that. Why did he make a vow to God? Why did he make a bargain with God? God, if you do this, then I'll do this. Because God was with him. He didn't understand what it meant to have faith in God. He didn't understand the power that God had. And we go through and read the book of Judges, and one thing we see over and over again is God giving victory to His faithful people. They win the battle. They overcome their oppressors. It was never because of the hand of man. You know, Gideon, what did he do? He had 20,000 shoulders. He shrunk it down. He shrunk it down. He shrunk it down because he wanted everybody to know that the victory would come by God's hand and not by Gideon's. Jephthah, all the other judges were unlikely heroes, and yet God used them for their weakness. Used them even though they had weakness, even though they had flaws, even though they had fears. The idea being is we have to put our faith and trust in God. We have to just give it to Him. His power is revealed in our frail lives. We're like jars of clay. That's what That's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. Everything belongs to Him. There's no need to have to bargain with God over things. It simply comes down to, do you trust God? Do you have faith that God's going to be with you? There's no conditional if. There's no conditional, God, if you do this, then I'll do that. Perhaps we're all guilty of that from time to time. God, if you'll just help me get through this trouble in my life. God, if you'll just heal my sick child. God, if you'll just get my son to come back to church, then I'll be dedicated. But it doesn't work that way. And when we attempt to bargain with God, we're putting ourselves up there with God. We're trying to control the situation, trying to control the outcome. Jephthah did not make a good vow. Is there even such a thing as a good vow? I think there is. I think marriage is a good vow. Well, on the subject of vows, Numbers chapter 30, Moses spoke to the heads of the tribe of the people of Israel, saying, "This is what the Lord commanded. If a man vows to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth." Vows were something that were not meant to be taken lightly. Vows to God were sacred. Jesus goes a step further in Matthew chapter 5, saying, "Let your yes be yes and your no be no." But as I mentioned earlier, the vow of marriage is one that is right and honorable and good in the eyes of God. The closeness that happens between two people when they come together as one, when they're united before God in marriage, it's kind of a shadow, a taste of what it will mean one day when we all will be united with God in that same type of closeness, intimacy. We're not bargaining or anything. We're simply making a vow of faith before God that we will give ourselves to the other person. They are ours. We are theirs. And it is good in the eyes of God. Jephthah did not make a good vow. He made a very foolish one. And his vow came because he lacked faith. Even though God was with him, he did not believe. And he said, "God, if you'll be with me, if you'll give me the victory, then I'll make sacrifice to you." Did God really want a sacrifice from Jephthah? Or Jephthah? No, he wanted his heart. He really wanted Jephthah to believe in him, to hold to him, to trust in him. I read a story about this little church in Michigan. The lottery had just gotten started, and it was after services one day. A lady came up to the preacher, and she told him that she had a chance to win $100,000. And she asked him, "I want you to pray for me, preacher, that I can win this money. And if you pray for me, then I promise if God lets me win, then I'll take $10,000 of that and I'll put it towards paving the church parking lot." There's that bargaining idea. God, if you'll do this, then I'll do that. God doesn't want bargains from us. God wants our love, our commitment. Deuteronomy chapter 6, we looked at this a while back. Moses said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." So do you really love God with your heart, soul, and strength if you're trying to bargain with God over things, over material things? No. And so we look at Yephtah's example, and we understand that that's not the route we want to go. We think about everything that God has already given us, everything that God has promised to us. Paul said it this way in Romans chapter 12, "Therefore I urge you to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship." What does God want from us? He wants us to give ourselves to Him. He doesn't want us to argue. He doesn't want us to argue. He wants all of us to present to Him a life that is well-pleasing, that is following in the footsteps of His Son that He gave to die for us, that we are going to live in a way that by everything we do, we glory and honor God. Because we trust God. We believe in God. We love God. How much do you love God? How much do you trust God? How much do you give to God? What does your relationship with God look like? The preacher tells the story of one Sunday, a man came to church. We'll say his name was Alan. Everybody knew Alan. Alan was confined to a wheelchair. He was an older man. His body, he had Parkinson's, and it was hard for him to talk. He couldn't really control his legs, his arms. But he came to worship. And you know, we sometimes will stand up and sing a song. And the song leader got up that day to sing "How Great Is Our God." A song that speaks of God's greatness and God's love and God's power. And everybody got up to stand. And this crumpled man who couldn't hardly do anything placed his hands on the pew and slowly pushed himself out of that chair until he was standing. Why? Because he wanted to honor God. He wanted to give to God because he loved God with his heart, soul, and strength. It mattered that his body was broken. It didn't matter that a tragic illness had took so much from him. He would still be faithful to God. I read Jephthah's story, and it reminds me of myself sometimes. I see something that I want. I see something that I think I need. I wish something would happen to a friend in my life. I wish they would come to know God. And in my head, I'm trying to make that bargaining that Jephthah did. Lord, if he'd just come to know you, my faith would be so much stronger. Lord, if we could just get past paying these bills, my faith in you would be renewed. Jephthah shows us what it means to not love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Because to love God with all of that means you have faith. And there's no doubt. You don't have to reason, barter, because you know God's going to take care of you. No matter what. That is the faith we are to have. That is the love that we are to have for God. What kind of faith do you have this morning in Him? What kind of trust do you put in God? Is it like Jephthah's, where you feel there has to be some kind of bargaining chip going on over the things that worry you? Or do you know? Do you believe? Do you trust that no matter what comes your way, God is with you, and God will help you overcome whatever that may be? If you have any need this morning, whether it's your decision to put on Christ in baptism or you need the prayers of the church, this opportunity is for you now as we stand and as we sing.